Guys, welcome to the next Legalease with the Ladies webinar. Appreciate everybody joining today. My name is Sean Whalin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of HopSkip. I'm going to first walk you through quickly our agenda. What we're going to cover today is around force majeure in light of the Delta variant and the vaccines. We're going to talk about vaccination mandates and how that's evolving over the course of COVID-19. And we're going to speak a little bit about how to negotiate with your partners during this time. The second half of today's webinar is going to be a Q&A. Thank you for everyone who submitted questions in advance. We greatly appreciate it. First, though, we're going to give you a quick background of who we are. So, like I said, my name is Sean Whalin. I am the co-founder and CEO of HopSkip. For those of you who might not be familiar with HopSkip, HopSkip is a platform that streamlines the way business groups and events are sourced and booked at hotels. I'll pass it over to Lisa to provide a quick background on herself, and we'll keep it rolling.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning, everybody. I'm Lisa Sommer Devlin. I'm an attorney from Phoenix, Arizona, and I exclusively represent hotels regarding convention and group-related matters, negotiations of contracts, and dealing with issues such as COVID-19 or cancellation or attrition or things of that matter. And oftentimes that involves working maybe against my friend and colleague, Barbara Dunn. Barbara?
Thanks, Lisa. Good day, everyone. Thanks for being with us. I'm Barbara Dunn. I'm a partner with Barnes & Thornburg based in Chicago, work exclusively with groups, corporate and not-for-profit, in connection with contracts for their meetings, conventions, and trade shows. And happy to be back with you. Again, thanks very much to the folks at HopSkip. And Lisa and I are representing today with your awesome t-shirts on T-Shirt Friday. So thanks.
We appreciate it. Barbara, Lisa, do you want to go over the legal disclaimer for today before we jump in?
Sure, I'll jump in. As we say every time we do one of these videos or webinars, what we are saying today is not legal advice. Every situation that you may be dealing with is unique and is completely dependent on the particular facts and circumstances involved. And so you have to consult with your attorney if you have a specific legal problem. What we're talking about today are just general concepts and information that may help you, but are not legal advice.
Excellent. Now that we got the fun stuff out of the way, before we jump into the content, we're going to first start with a poll to do a temperature check from the audience of when do you expect to start sourcing hotels for new events? So I'm going to launch a poll now, and we'll be happy to share the results as well, of course. Wow, looks like, I'm assuming, can folks see right now the answers that are getting shared for the poll?
I can't, John.
Got it. Can you see now?
Nope.
All right. Well, I don't know if anyone in you might not be able to because you're a panelist, Lisa, but either way, we'll make sure this is shared when we distribute the recording for the webinar, which will be early next week. And I can read these off the polls as they're coming in right now. It looks like about 61% of folks have already started sourcing hotels for new events. The second highest is I don't know at 16. And then the two that are tied are at 9% before the end of the year and Q1 of 2022. Q2 of 2022 is the lowest percentage, which I think is optimistic indicators. So we appreciate everybody answering, and it looks like we're good to keep moving. Thanks, guys. All right. The first topic we're going to cover, I'll pass it over to Legalease with the Ladies, force majeure in light of the Delta variant and vaccines. Barbara and Lisa, you want to take it away?
Barbara, why don't you start?
Sounds good. Thanks, Sean. Well, I would like to say that, things are improving, and I love the fact that we're getting that informal feed on the statistics, but unfortunately, our best hopes of being past this thing are not here yet. And, certainly from my vantage point on the group side, we had a bit of a honeymoon period, if you will. I think in late spring, early summer, when the vaccine rates were coming up, we weren't seeing Delta yet. We were booking a lot of new contracts, and then Delta kind of hit late July, early August. And so it's changed things, as is the case always. And again, just when you think you have your plans all set, everyone knows that this threw a wrench in it. So definitely dealing with clients on Delta related issues with cancellations, many in the short term, because many organizations had fully intended to go forward with in person, but for this latest development. So it's raised a lot of issues. Similarly, we've obviously seen issues with vaccine hesitancy, certain states having laws that aren't necessarily favorable to vaccines and mask mandates and everything in between. So definitely working with clients. And just to echo something Lisa said in the disclaimer, is to say that, we're really here on the business advice. We obviously have the legal background, but Lisa and I deal with this day in and day out. So it will give you our best business strategies when it comes to this topic. And I think this particular topic has been tough. And Lisa, from my vantage point, our resolution of these Delta cancellations, if you will, or Delta attrition related issues is a little bit different than it was last year. In some ways, certainly it's very good in that we have the vaccines and more folks coming out to the meetings. But by the same token, we're having challenges on the group side, of course, bringing people to meetings and getting them off. And Lisa, I know on the hotel side, challenges there as well, kind of getting fully ramped up and then having this Delta come into play.
Well, and thanks, Barbara. And I kind of look at it from a different angle, perhaps. Yes, the Delta variant has been devastating, but I think people need to come at this situation with a different attitude. When we had 2020, meetings could not happen. There were government restrictions in place. That prevented meetings of certain size or prevented meetings at all. There were government suggestions or recommendations against travel, all kinds of things that said you can't do this. And that's not really the case that we're in now. What we are in now is a situation where the government restrictions are gone. Hotels are open and operational, and the CDC is saying that vaccinated people are free to travel. And so what we're dealing with is people who are unvaccinated that are causing this Delta surge, and we're dealing with people that are hesitant or reluctant. And as Barbara knows, I always say force majeure is when you can't do something. If you don't want to, that's a business decision. And so I think the problem that we're facing with the Delta situation in the industry is hotels are looking at it like this is going to continue. As long as there's going to be people that are not vaccinated, or as long as there are areas of the world where vaccines are not yet available, COVID is going to continue, even though meetings could still take place. And so my hotel clients are saying, we're ready, we're able, and so we're not necessarily agreeing that Delta is a force majeure. And I think that that's really the problem, as Barbara is saying. We're, from the customer side, they're having concerns, and from the hotel side saying, we can't absorb this loss when we're open. And so I think that that's the big struggle in the industry right now. Sean, you want to move on to our next slide? Because all of this kind of goes together over the course of our discussion today.
Totally agree. Next topic, vaccination mandates. What are you guys seeing of how that's changing, and what are some best practices that you're experiencing today?
I'm seeing that venues, and I'm using that in a broad sense, hotels, centers, bars, nightclubs, whatever it might be, are adopting their own policies because a lot of governments are reluctant to do that. I know some governments are doing vaccine mandates for people to go into certain places, but I'm seeing, I went to a concert venue last week that you had to show your vaccine card in order to gain entry. And I think it's going to happen in different ways in different places. In terms of hotels, my clients aren't mandating that people be vaccinated to come in, but they are continuing their COVID protocols. So I think the vaccine mandates come more from the group side. Barbara, what are your customers and clients saying?
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. I agree with you. We went in the last probably 3 or 4 months from clients viewing a vaccine mandate for a meeting as a deterrent for people to come, to now viewing vaccine mandates as a reason to come or an incentive to come. In other words, oh, good, now I can come to your meeting. Now my company policy, for example, might allow me to come to your meeting. So I think that's good in that way, that certainly the pendulum is shifting. At the same time, there's just so many different varying positions on this, and groups are really left with, a lot of uncertainty whether they mandate the vaccine outright, or whether they would allow a negative COVID test or the vaccine. A lot of discussion on that front. A lot of clients have moved in that area. A lot of really good third-party providers that have come on the scene to help clients to have attendees upload data, all the rest with that. And I think that's going to be helpful. The other side of the coin is really thinking ahead on the group side and planning, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And this just shone a light on crisis management. I've been working with clients, large trade shows coming up, on what to do if there's an issue on site. And that goes with any type of crisis, but certainly with regard to COVID as well, even up to the point of communications and standpoint. So it's really something that I think groups, I have very few groups that have chosen to just disregard any health or safety protocols, but more are adopting ones that either mandate the vaccine. And if is the case with the president's mandate and private employers, 100 or more being required to have their employees vaccinated, the pool of people that might remain unvaccinated may be smaller, and then maybe that's the groups can move away from having to lay down the law, so to speak, on this issue, knowing that the larger sense of the population is vaccinated. So it continues to evolve, Sean.
Perfect. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Lisa. How would you both suggest, from either side of the table, negotiating with your partners during this time? And has that anything changed as a result of COVID in terms of negotiations?
I think the difference is lack of negotiation, at least, and perhaps it's because I'm the lawyer and so I only get the ones that are a problem, but I'm seeing so many situations where the go-to position of the customer is they have a legal letter that says, we're not coming because of the Delta variant and we're excused. And I don't think that's the way to do it. I think the way to do it is to approach your partner and say, here are our concerns. Here's what our registration is. Here's what's happening. How can we work together to see if we can make an event happen, or is it just not going to happen? But to have a discussion rather than taking hard and fast positions. Barbara, what are you telling your folks?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely the case, Lisa. I've been telling clients to issue notice letters light. In other words, referencing the conditions, but opening the door to the discussions that you mentioned. And I think that's particularly important. As we've always said, at least you and I agree on this point, customers as hotel come hat in hand, if you will, when you're starting these conversations. And I agree, those are the conversations that happen. The challenge I find is that many of my clients will say the hotel just wants to dig in, if you will, on the force majeure argument and doesn't want to work with us either on a modification to the meeting or a rebook situation, or even paying money. So there's a lot of issues there that I think can be impediments. Granted, as I understand, hotels are owned by owners and they make final decisions. And I think to your point, Lisa, we're seeing less discussions and more, go to the heart of the matter. But that also allows the group, and this is something I've been, identifying group, is, come prepared to come to the table. Come prepared to share a short-term option with a long-term option too. And when I mean short-term option, a lot of these cancellations happen very last minute. There's definitely expenses and exposures on the hotel's part. Groups should think about, obviously offsetting that with some kind of payment. But in the longer term, if a meeting can't happen, looking to put another meeting at the property. And where I've found lately is that the fix is so much on, Lisa, the hotel's position of just this short-term immediate that I don't want to talk to yet about a long-term. And I think that's unfortunate. I don't think that's, of course, the case across the board. And I do think these ongoing discussions will help clients kind of come to that. But that's a development I think I'm seeing more recently, Lisa. And I don't know if you want to weigh in on that as well.
I think the problem is that when customers are coming to hotels and saying, we have to cancel this event and we shouldn't have to pay you. At the same time, they're having other customers saying, well, we are upset with the hotel because your staffing isn't where it should be. And the hotel has to staff according to their occupancy. And the hotel is saying, look, you're saying you can't come. I'm looking around and I'm having a meeting right now of the same size as this meeting that you're trying to cancel. And so the hotel is saying, again, it's not that you can't, it's that you don't want to. And so I agree with Barbara. If you can come armed to the hotel and say, look, our registration is only at 30% and we can't make our budget if that's what our event is, then offer to share that financial hit, because the hotel is going to take a financial hit if you walk away, and you're going to take a financial hit if you try and have a meeting that underperforms. And so try to figure out a financial way that both parties can get something out of it. I have a client who I think is listening today who recently was on the phone with me and said, we'd rather have a piece of pie than no pie at all. Even though we can't get the whole pie, maybe we can get a piece of it. And I think we have to recognize that everything is changing going forward over the last 20 months, and we have to address each situation at the time rather than taking hard and fast positions.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Lisa. And I think the pie is a great example. Unfortunately, I've got clients that put the piece of pie out there. They're kind of getting it pushed back. If you're going to come, I want you to fully perform. I'm not going to modify the block. I'm not going to modify the food and beverage minimum. At the same time, you've got other groups that are invoking cancellation and walking away. So I do feel in some settings, and again, like you, I get the worst of the situations, right? That there is some resistance in, always thought some pie is better than no pie, but there's been a lot of resistance. And I describe that to clients as an economic barrier. In other words, groups saying to the hotel, you not being willing to either proportionally reduce room block, food and beverage minimums in light of this or waive it altogether, that's an economic barrier to us having this meeting. And I think that viewing it that way, I think is an important, again, from the group's perspective, certainly. And I think that's the case. I really would push for that. One other comment, certainly, as you've said, a lot of hotels position the doors are open, the lights are on, we've had other groups. I think a recognition, this is obvious, that every group is different, every contract is different. So, while a hotel may have hosted a leisure group or a college athletic group, doesn't mean it, it's ready, or a doctor's group or whatever other group, that's the same. And I think groups tend to go back on their heels when they hear that too. So I think there's a recognition there, admittedly, again, on both sides, about some of the limitations, but very much so do I agree that should be where we are. I just think that for various reasons, some people that want to go forward seem to be getting penalized over people that choose to cancel.
Thank you both. All right. So before we jump into the Q&A portion, we wanted to let everybody know who's joined today that your feedback has been incredibly valuable. That's how we form really the agenda of these webinars. And the feedback that we've gotten across both the planner and hotel community has been super positive with the Legalease with the Ladies brand. And we've actually created a resource page for you to be able to, on demand, go to this page and learn about a lot of various different contract topics, as well as some topics that Lisa and Barbara have recorded around COVID-19 specifically. So we're going to share that link. I believe one of the HopSkip team members will put that link in the chat, but we'll also share the link to this webpage when we distribute the recording on Monday of next week. Again, thank you to everyone who's provided this feedback, because it's really important to the HopSkip team and to the Legalease with the Ladies team that we're supporting the industry during these hard times, because we know it's challenging and we're all in it together. All right, I'm going to now switch over to the Q&A, and these are the questions that were submitted in advance of the webinar, but we definitely encourage you using the chat or the Q&A function on Zoom to continue to submit questions, because like I just mentioned, A lot of your questions and feedback form the topics for the next webinar, so please don't hesitate to continue asking questions. All right, to kick it off, first question we have, clients are requesting COVID language in contracts. Are venues or hotels adding new COVID language in their contracts?
From the hotel perspective, the answer is generally no. And the reason for that is, while when COVID was new, there were clauses that addressed COVID, but COVID's not new now. And the position is that it is not the disease or the COVID that is causing problems. It's the government regulations and restrictions that do cause events to cancel. And so from the hotel side, we're not going to add language like COVID or epidemics or pandemics because we're already there. The point of a force majeure clause or clauses like that is to deal with unanticipated circumstances. Well, COVID is not unanticipated. We're right in the middle of it. And so we're pushing back on that kind of language. We will agree to language that says if your event can't take place because of government restrictions, whether that's on travel or whether that's on meeting size or whatever it might be, then we all agree then you're excused under those circumstances. But COVID is here. It's not going to go away. It's going to be here for an extended period. And so hotels are not going to feel comfortable about saying you can cancel because of COVID. Barbara, what are you seeing?
Yeah, Lisa, I'm seeing the same, although I definitely am seeing on the hotel side a lot of specific COVID language and really baking in a multi-step process in order that a group in a hotel would need to go through in order for a group to exercise cancellation. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Certainly good faith discussions, potential modifications of the contract, et cetera. But, I do see it as out there. And, you made the point about a COVID specific clause that might speak to the government regulations, et cetera. Certainly I'm seeing that as well. But from the group's perspective, if a group is going to sign a contract now, and there is a potential of it not being able to perform in March of 2022, that issue needs to be addressed. How it is addressed, a whole bunch of ways to do that. Potentially a COVID specific clause, like you mentioned, Lisa, but also negotiating the flexibility on your room block and your food and beverage minimums, negotiating flexibility on your cancellation fee schedule. There's some business strategies that could work here too. But having said all of that, I don't think it's a heavy lift to say that groups and hotels should recognize that what the situation is today, and that groups who are going forward with meetings need that flexibility. And that's something that I think should be addressed in the contract. I don't know that it needs to be COVID specific. Unforeseeable, yes, I understand that being the law of the force majeure, but again, clients and the hotels can negotiate their own clauses. I mean, if we took everything today that is foreseeable beyond COVID, obviously global warming and a zillion other things, I mean, I don't think we want to go down that path. I think we're really focusing on the business proposition. And I agree, be it mandates or be it, we hadn't yet talked still about international travel restrictions that remain in place. Those are still driving factors. So if a hotel, wants to encourage the group to get back in the water, and obviously the groups do want to get back in the water. By the way, in as much I know is absolutely the hotel industry is hurting. These groups, many of them have not been able to have their main revenue meetings for 2 years or more. So they're very incentivized to get back in the water too. But I do think it's that flexibility that needs to be there. It doesn't have to everything, and we've said this before, I know, Lisa, not everything has to pass through the path of force majeure. Think about it from a business perspective, again, on both sides. I think if you approach it in that way, you can negotiate it and set it up in a way where your business team is okay with it and the legal team is okay with it.
I really want to put a point on what Barbara just said. Instead of doing it in a COVID clause, whatever that means, put in business terms about room block reviews, releases, those kinds of things. You're going to get a lot more traction with your hotel partners doing that than you are by asking for a COVID specific clause. Definitely. Awesome. I had one recently where the clause negotiated saying, if we have not achieved X% of our room pickup by so many days before the event, then we can adjust the block or we can do this or that. You're going to get a lot more traction with that than you are with a COVID clause.
Excellent. And this is a really hot question that we've seen quite a bit. So I think that insight you both provided right there is going to be a big help for the planner community specifically. All right, next question. Can staff members be required to attend in-person events if it is part of their job description?
Yes, so
Barbara, you can-
yeah, absolutely. So I'll take this one lead. We're dealing with that certainly on behalf of all of our clients on the labor and employment side. The short answer to the question is yes. If it's someone's job description to be on site at a meeting and the meeting is going forward, the answer is yes. Now, employers haven't wanted to leverage that. Many employers still are trying to figure out about their own vaccine policy, those potentially who aren't impacted by the president's mandate that are under 100 employees, for example, are still working through that. But at the end of the day, yes. And so that's been an issue. I mean, groups have kind of tiptoed in being sensitive to individuals who don't want to travel on site. And they've been, I certainly think they would continue to want to be sensitive to that. Certainly also, they don't want to lose good people. So I think that's always present. But having said that, we are at a time, if it's a health circumstance with that individual, a different scenario. If it's a health circumstance with regard to someone in that individual's household, that's where I think there's a tipping point. So I think it's a matter of walking the line. These OSHA, EOC, this stuff is changing every day, the guidance that we're seeing. So I definitely encourage you on this issue to talk to your legal eagle. The short answer is yes, but there's a heck of a lot of longer answers. But even more than that, there's some just practical strategies that groups have employed when they rolled out policies about travel, about returning to the office and the like. And so I think that's something that groups are going to struggle with. And, obviously, everyone wants staff to remain safe, and we want folks to feel comfortable traveling as much as they can. And that goes back also to, where that bar is set with the meeting in terms of health and safety protocols overall. Lisa, are you seeing that as well? Questions within the hotel side?
I agree. And the important thing here is when somebody says, I don't want to go to this event, the question is to ask why. What are the circumstances that are making them uncomfortable? What are their personal issues? And maybe you can work out some kind of compromise. Maybe the person is afraid of being in a really crowded meeting room, and so they can do on-site work that doesn't put them in that position. Again, it's got to be a negotiation and a discussion. And I think that that's important. I also think that from the supplier side, I think that suppliers are going to have more success in restaffing the more vaccinations are happening, because those employees are less uncomfortable about working in a public place as vaccination rates go up. So it works on both sides.
Great point. What suggestion do you have if the client does not think that protocol should be in place for events and meetings?
I'll start from the group side on this question. I do have clients that, don't want to recognize COVID or don't want to have anything specific on health and safety. Many times it's because they're concerned about the impact that might have on the meeting, that their attendees don't want to think about it or focus on it. I think there's a baseline, always the duty to provide a safe environment for the meeting. And I think COVID being what it is, and certainly the Delta variant being what it is, I don't think you can certainly disregard it altogether. At a minimum, the group's going to have to comply with whatever the local state ordinances rules are when it comes to gathering sizes, face coverings, et cetera. So that's going to always be there. But I do think it's important for the group to consider health and safety protocols. Again, there's a segment, even if the thought is that folks will react negatively to some of these health and safety protocols that groups have put into place, a lot of individuals will react positively to that. And that's something that I think groups should consider. So I don't think you have to hit it in a really heavy way, but I do think you should recognize it. And I do think you should look, obviously, at a minimum, needing to comply with local laws, but also looking at it from just a practical side. We're all pretty conditioned now, whether we're in a work capacity or personal capacity, to wear things like face coverings and socially distance. So I don't think it's the protocols that groups are trying to put in are definitely, any push really beyond that. but I do think it's good to recognize it. And that's been my guidance, Sean and Lisa, from the hotel's perspective. I know you've heard that as well, coming from the customer side.
Well, and as Barbara says, the important thing is everybody has to comply with the law. So whatever the applicable law is in that jurisdiction, whether it's state or federal or local, you're going to have to comply with that. And the customer can't say, no, we're not going to do that. The venue also has the obligation and the right to set its own policies. And so if the venue has policies in place and the event coordinator doesn't want to do that, they still have to comply with the policies of the venue. And the venue does have that responsibility. And you need to look at it from the long haul. We all know no shoes, no shirt, no service. Well, that's a safety and health thing. That's why that's there. It used to be that you were allowed to smoke in all kinds of venues. You can't do that anymore for health and safety reasons. So as we're going forward in the longer term, policies like mask policies are just going to become a health and safety thing that everybody's going to have to follow, or else vaccination policies. So if somebody is saying for whatever reason that they don't want those protocols, I think you need to fall back and say the venue is responsible for protecting the safety of the people that come to the venue, and they have the right to set what those policies are.
Awesome. All right, our next question. Could you please define the difference between inadvisable and commercially impracticable? Examples would be great.
Well,
Barbara, Lisa,
sure.
either?
Inadvisable is a term that you never, ever, ever want to use in your contracts. And that's because it is a completely subjective term, and it will only buy you disputes. Because if you as the customer say, we don't want to perform, we think it's inadvisable, your hotel or venue partner is going to say, we disagree, and you're just buying a dispute. Commercially impracticable is a legally defined term. There are court cases and law encyclopedias and all kinds of things out there that define what commercially impracticable means. And it basically means that your contract is impacted to the point that while you might technically be able to perform, it's no longer viable to do so. So for example, you have a particular speaker that was supposed to come and that speaker can't be there. You can have the event, but there's no point in doing so. Or what we're seeing now in the Delta variant situations, the hotel is open and operational. You could have the event, but you can demonstrate that only 5 people out of 10,000 are going to show up. Yes, you could have the event, but your entire purpose for doing so no longer applies. So because that's legally defined, that's something that you can hang your hat on. Inadvisable is not. Barbara, do you disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand that inadvisable is not ideal. I know some people listening are probably freaking out that they have just that word in there. But that said, if inadvisable goes out with friends, I think it's good. If inadvisable from a health standpoint, from a safety standpoint, maybe building in an exception for financial reasons. We often see that in contracts, right? I think it's viable. Now, I absolutely agree with you, Lisa, on commercial impracticability, as are the examples as well. Also think about the threshold percentage of people not being able to come or impacted from coming. And you mentioned that as a workaround earlier, Lisa. I think it's a good strategy, but I want to just make sure folks understand. Sometimes percentages are in force majeure clauses in the grocery list section, right? Travel disruptions impacting X% from traveling. But what we're talking about here is the second requirement of the clause. That's the standard of impact. So sometimes folks say, well, it says right here, it's 20%. Well, that's just something to check the grocery list on, right? Now I've got to say that that force majeure event has a particular impact on my meeting. So I'm seeing more groups and hotels gravitate away from inadvisable, certainly, potentially away from commercially impracticable, and settle on percentages as that standard of impact and negotiate from that standpoint. And I think that's a viable option, Lisa. I mean, obviously the hotels and clients are going to disagree with the numbers. I mean, a hotel might put in 75% and the group puts in 15%, but at the end of the day, I think that point you're making is having that objective factor to look at. So I think it's a good strategy, but I do think you also have to step back and look at the mechanics, if you will, of the clause, because Lisa, I know you're looking at those and drafting those too. There's a lot of times that it's all mixed together, and it makes it very difficult, again, on both sides to interpret.
Yeah, and I agree with Barbara. Don't mix it together. I would say have your standard force majeure clause that's based on illegal, impossible, commercially impracticable. And then if you want to have a separate clause that's based on percentages, that the parties can agree that there's a level of impact at which it's not financially viable to go forward, I think that that's a separate concept and a separate clause. That's the way I would do it.
Perfect. And on that note, so we hear this question quite often from the planner community. And one of the things that Barbara and Lisa have greatly contributed to the HopSkip platform for is actually building out a contract clause education center inside of the HopSkip platform to help both planners and hoteliers get accustomed to the standard contract clauses and provisions that they should expect to see in their agreements. So we have actually created a poll here that I'm going to launch. If anybody is interested in checking out the HopSkip Contract Clause Education Center, which was really developed by Barbara and Lisa, the brains behind it, we would love the opportunity to show you. So please feel free to answer either yes, please, or no, thanks. And we'll reach out to coordinate some time to give you a walkthrough. I'm going to allow a couple more folks to be able to get their answers in, and we'll keep it moving. All right. Thank you to everyone who answered. The next question we have, can you require venues and their staff or in-house providers to follow your COVID-19 guidelines if they are more strict than local or state guidelines?
I'll jump in on this time for the group side. I'd love to say yes, but I'm going to have to give an it depends here, because there are states which the prohibitions on masks, face coverings, on vaccine mandates are so restrictive that a group might not be able, for example, if it had a vaccine only mandate and it wanted to push that to the vendor and the employees at that venue, they may not be able to do so. However, what I have found as a workaround here is voluntarily. In other words, if I voluntarily wear a face covering, then you employer are not mandating it. And I know this seems ridiculous to say, but I've been on many a call with saying, well, the group wants everyone face coverings, and venue says we can't mandate face coverings. I say for our employees, my response is fine. Give me 25 people who will voluntarily wear a face covering. I mean, there's a customer service aspect to that. And I think that's our workaround. But generally speaking, hotels and venues have been working very well together in these guidelines. Just as Lisa mentioned, sometimes a group wants to, doesn't want to comply locally and the venue is pressing that. Similarly, the group might ask the venue to put in place additional measures. Again, I found in large part that's true, but this is something definitely you want to check state, local law on this issue wherever your meeting is held. Because again, of late, there have been some states where you might not be able to mandate a vaccine or mandate a face covering, but there might be other workarounds.
I agree with Barbara. It's a discussion. You go to your partner and you say, this is what we would like to have, instead of saying we require this. This is what we would like to have. What strategies do you have for accommodating what we would like to do? And that way, again, as Barbara says, voluntary things, everybody can do whatever they want to do on a voluntary basis. So I think there's workarounds, but it can be difficult.
Perfect. Thank you both. All right. Most hotels are now basically saying COVID is in the past, and they are not willing to agree in writing that they will take measures to sanitize facilities, i.e. have hand sanitizers available, staff wearing masks, etc. Nor will they set up spaces to support social distancing. How would you approach that? And I know, of course, this is a little bit generalized, but Barbara, Lisa, do you want to take a stab at this?
Well, let me jump in, since I'm the one that represents hotels. That is certainly not my experience. I certainly have not heard anybody say COVID is in the past or anything like that. Every hotel client that I work with and other hotel clients that I don't work with, if you go to their website, they all have policies and procedures and protocols for dealing with COVID that, you know, involve extra cleaning and masks and all those kinds of things. So I'm really surprised to hear somebody say that this is the pushback that they're getting. COVID is not in the past. It's not going to go away anytime soon, and everybody's going to have to continue these kinds of things. So if you feel that your hotel partner is acting like COVID is gone, I think you need to, first of all, move it up the chain, go farther up the chain in the hotel itself, or if necessary in the brand, to say, hey, we think these things are important and we'd like some help in implementing this during our event, because I don't think these protocols are going to change anytime soon. I think what you may be hearing, not that COVID is in the past, but that certain restrictions are in the past. And I've talked about that earlier today. The restrictions on numbers of people or requiring certain distancing or those kinds of things are largely gone, but that doesn't mean that all the other protocols are gone as well. Barbara, what are you seeing?
Yeah, Lisa, no, that's right. I mean, I haven't seen an outright resistance or a hotel saying this. I have had hotels and convention center venues want to charge groups for these. So obviously additional space, using a plexiglass that they had to use last week that they don't have to use this week, cleaning surcharges, et cetera. So, obviously there's a business aspect to this, which we all understand. But when it went from a restriction to to the restriction being lifted, there's an economic impact. I'll just say that for whatever it's worth. But I have had groups and hotels be able to work together. I think the point is you've got to have that conversation. And again, I think the acknowledgement is that we could quibble all day as to whether COVID's in the past or not. Let's hope it might be, or maybe it is moving in that direction. This is what we need to get people back in the water to come to our meeting. Similarly, obviously the hotel has its demands and wants to fill space. So this is a conversation, and I agree. If you're not getting resolution at the level where you are, you definitely need to escalate it. And that's unfortunate. It happens, but it's been my experience that hotels have been willing to work with groups, and we've been able to negotiate through. One of the things we're seeing is additional charges because of the differing food and beverage service, right? That might have been required under current restrictions at that time, aren't required anymore, yet it's the group's preference. So I do like your strategy, Lisa, of saying this is how we want it to look. This is what we think will get more people to come to our meeting. Bingo, right? That's the way to approach it. And I think if you approach it in that way, you'll be successful in that endeavor, and not have that resistance. I think that, and look, don't forget, you can always negotiate with your feet and look elsewhere. And, again, I hate to think that'd be the case, but that's the reality of it.
All right, next question. Hotels are reluctant to address the drastic staffing shortage and inability to meet service standards previously in place. What advice do you have for approaching this with our hotel partner? Lisa, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure. This is one of those classic conundrums that you have, because the hotel doesn't have the staff levels because it doesn't have the occupancy, and yet customers are demanding that the hotel verify that it has the same staffing that it had before COVID. So this is going to be a building process, and again, I know we say this all the time, working together process. If a hotel only has 200 rooms occupied out of 1,000 rooms because of the nature of what's going on right now, they're not going to be at full staffing level. They can't operate that way. And so what you need to be doing when you're talking with your hotels is saying, what are you going to do to have adequate staff for my event when there's going to be 500 people? Where are you going to get those people? And as Barbara's pointing out, I think things are going to continue to get better as there's more vaccine mandates and more vaccinations going on out there. I think people that have been reluctant to go back to hospitality jobs will start returning more. I know hotels are actively recruiting, but again, it's a chicken and egg thing. They can only staff to match the occupancy that they have, and they're not going to be able to make promises to you until that occupancy returns. And Barbara and I, deal with this firsthand and are going to be dealing with it after this presentation today. So Barbara, what do you think?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a game of chicken, right? One can't come before the other. They both have to jump into the water at the same time, which is it's just a scary proposition. Having said that, I agree with you, Lisa. I think everyone, it does come to a frustration, I will say, from the group side, in that a group might be expected to perform under a contract at 100% of its level or face attrition fees or food and beverage minimum. And yet the hotel might say, but we don't have to perform at 100% level, right? So that's just obviously a generalization of the issue. That said, one thing I think is critically important, and that is more frequent and potentially more thorough site inspections and site visits. I mean, I'm recommending this to my clients. First of all, dust off your site inspection checklist. If you had one, if you didn't have one, develop it. Consider adding in some of the newer things about the cleaning and the ventilation, et cetera. But go on more site inspections when you can in person. I think that makes a big difference, because I agree, Lisa, you could talk about staffing ratios, but if I'm checking in a hotel, I'm standing in line, that's going to be my experience, right? Or I'm going to the restaurant and I can't because it's closed. That's going to be my experience. So I think that's something that groups should absolutely do and invest in. And I think hotels would be smart to incentivize groups, cover costs or share costs for additional site inspections, including, in many cases, I've said, even consider a site visit, within 30 days or even 2 weeks of your meeting before you even get on site, because so much is changing. And I think it is important to see that. And the whole point of this exercise is to make sure the bad thing doesn't happen, right? So that's your way of rooting out concerns and addressing those with the hotel ahead of the meeting, as opposed to coming on site and doing a pre-con and then having it be a big issue. So this, to me, this is a troubleshooting issue. I agree, though, it's going to be an ongoing challenge. I'm hopeful, as you are, more folks wanting to come to meetings, and the hotel, more folks wanting to come back to the industry is going to help change that.
Excellent. And on that site inspection topic that you just brought up, Barbara, we have on the HopSkip blog 167 question checklist for site inspections. So feel free to go to the HopSkip blog to download that. It's a resource for free, of course, for you guys, but we'll also make sure it's distributed out as well when we send out the recorded version of the webinar next week. Okay, next question. I'm hearing from many planners about hard lines drawn on attrition and F&B minimums to help make up for lost revenue. How do we best protect ourselves? Lisa or Barbara, one of you guys want to kick this off?
Well, obviously hotels have had a terrible go of it in the last 20 months. And so they are trying to book real business. They want to be able to go to their owners and say, I booked this meeting worth $500,000, and that's what we're going to be able to put in the bank. And if you are putting in squishy attrition or really low attrition, they can't do that, or weak cancellation clauses. So I don't know if drawing hard lines is the answer, but I think that, as Barbara and I have been saying all along, there are lots of negotiation strategies that you can use so that you can have room block reviews at various points to release rooms back to the hotel without liability or reduced liability, or you can have thresholds that you have to meet, things like that. People are going to have to be creative, because as we're coming back together, both sides have to be able to plan for the future and know what their liabilities are going to be. And so I think that if you adopt some of those creative things that Barbara and I have been talking about today, you're going to be able to get around these kinds of issues. Barbara, what are you doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa, I agree. And as I'd mentioned earlier, I really see that if there are hard lines, and yes, I have had clients report those hard lines, and we were trying to work through those, they really are economic barriers to having the meeting. And you're really addressing the wrong set. You've got a group that wants to come, right? Is planning on coming, is putting resources behind coming, and you want that hotel to be working with you. And I think that's the point. This goes back to what we saw after 2008 in the economic downturn. There was a big push to right-size contracts, and the hotels and groups worked very well together in order to do that. The whole point is, if we're seeing a train wreck coming, we want to do something about it ahead of time. So being able to release the block, release function space, allows the hotel to resell that space. And that's important to the hotel. And that's where I think the parties should work together. Similarly, hotels should ask groups, what are you doing to get people to come to the meeting? And I've told my clients, let them know. It's not just a one-sided conversation. Let them know what you're doing to get people to come to the meeting. Let them know what you think might help get people to the meeting, right? That's the same discussions that we've had as well. So I think that's something, again, we look to. One other thing that I've mentioned here and there occasionally is something different is, we talk about room block reductions, right? X%, certain amount of time out. Food and beverage minimum, a lot of times it's set as a stated, right? We don't have those opportunities to reduce it. I am seeing more clients move toward that direction. So if it's a strategy that'll work for you, it might be something to think about. I had one hotel in the client's case have a per person price and have a sliding scale built on that. So I just thought that was a good strategy to address something like food and beverage, which is just something that really hadn't been addressed much other than negotiating on the dollar amount and whether you're going to pay, the full difference on the dollar amount and what you use or a percentage of that, but really thinking ahead. But bottom line is we want to be proactive, not reactive. And I think this is exactly the case. I'll tell you, the hotels that continue to take a hard and fast line on this are pushing the groups to cancel. The group might want to, I've had many clients, I've talk off the ledge. The group might want to cancel, and the hotel is almost pushing them to do that by not having these conversations. So I'm not saying both parties don't have to give. I'm just saying they should have the conversations. And if they're not, then I do think that's a problem.
And something I would add to that I don't see happening a lot is when customers are saying we're not getting good registration, we're not getting good pickup, hotels are often very willing to do joint marketing to try and build interest, to try and push people to come to the meeting, or they may offer incentives to individuals to try and get them to come. So go to your hotel partner and say, hey, we're having trouble getting people to register for this event. What ideas do you have to help us? And they'll consider doing that. That's something to think about.
It's a great point, Lisa. Like both of you mention all the time, it's a two-way street, open conversation. Planners and hoteliers are partners in this process. Excuse me. All right, we're going to break here for a quick poll question on the topic of financials. We know as planners, when you're evaluating proposals, there's a lot of nitty-gritty costs that goes into the overall projected proposal cost. So for those of the folks that are on this webinar today that are not HopSkip users yet, we wanted to make sure that you are aware that on the HopSkip platform, you're able to, with the click of a button, download a financial reports that gives you the ability to project how much each proposal is going to cost. So if you're interested in checking those out, I'm going to throw up a quick poll question now. And feel free to answer either yes, please, or no, thanks, if you're interested in checking that out. And we'll get moving on to the next question here. I'm going to give it another 5 seconds or so. All right. Next question is, if clients are signing contracts now during the pandemic, can they really claim illegal and impossible or force majeure 3 months later? How do you address limitations on international travel?
Yeah, so I think we kind of talked about this earlier when we were talking about the COVID specific language. And again, I think you have to be very mindful if you're signing a contract now for a meeting in the short term that COVID may impact the meeting. So it can be addressed, I think, in a number of different ways. I think on the path forward, again, being proactive on that point will be important, but the flexibility that's there needs to, also be built into the contract. Again, adjustments to the room block, food and beverage. That to me is what the path forward looks like. I'm quibbling on this point. It may be very difficult to argue illegality right now without the restrictions or strict impossibility. But again, what the parties should be doing is focusing on what that will make each side comfortable to come to the table and have a contract that they can live with. And I think that's really where the focus should be. Lisa?
I agree. My position is everybody knows we're in the middle of a pandemic. That's why you don't include COVID or epidemic or pandemic or anything like that in your force majeure clause, because it's not going to help you. Have different clauses to address the issues as we've been talking about today. In terms of international travel, trends seem to indicate that restrictions on international travel are going to be lifted. But in the meantime, if you're booking an event that has an international travel component, if it's critical to you that 40% of your people are international, again, build that into your contract as a separate clause saying, we will not pay attrition if our people can't come because there are international travel restrictions, but you're going to have to be able to show that those 40% of your people couldn't make it. You know, it can't just be, well, yeah, it's looking bad. You need to have objective and measurable standards that say, this is why these people can't come, and in that case, attrition won't apply to them. Or I've had a discussion recently with an event that said, we can't have the event without the international people. Even though our local people can come, the purpose of our meeting is not going to happen if we can't have those international people. If that's the case, that has to be a discussion during your negotiations, and it has to be memorialized in the contract so that everybody understands that if those international travel restrictions are still there, that the meeting can't happen. So it's something you need to contract over.
Yeah, and Lisa, one question that just popped up in the chat that's related to that is that concept of frustration of purpose. So just as you were explaining earlier about the purpose of the meeting and that purpose being defeated by the current circumstance, I think having that purpose statement is helpful, but I think to your point, having objective measures like a percentage is probably a good strategy. And from the group side, to the extent you will document it, I think that's a reasonable ask. Figure out what that might look like. But I think that's a reasonable workaround and not battling over the purpose and everything else. I think that should be something, those types of standards for these particular meetings is something that groups should think about building a separate clause as you suggested, rather than putting it in the force majeure clause.
And let me add to that frustration of purpose. Frustration of purpose is a very, very narrow legal doctrine. And I'm seeing people putting in purpose clauses that say the purpose of this event is for our people to get together and network. That's not a purpose clause. It's got to be the purpose of this meeting is to launch this new product, and then the product doesn't launch. Or the purpose of this meeting is to have 500 people from Indonesia come to meet our local people. You know, then you can see that those 500 people can't come because of that travel restriction. But it can't be just something general like to get together and network and talk amongst yourselves. That's not a frustration of purpose. It needs to be something very, very specific.
Awesome. And thank you to everyone who joined. Special thanks to Barbara and Lisa for today's insights. We can't thank the community enough for the valuable support and feedback that you've provided. That you are the reason why we continue to do these webinars. So special thank you to everyone who registered and also who attended today. For those folks that did register, HopSkip is currently offering planners and hoteliers 25% off when purchasing a subscription before the end of this month. And if you'd like to learn more about HopSkip, feel free to respond to this poll now. We'll reach out and we'll get a demo on the books. We'd love to show you how HopSkip streamlines your sourcing and planning process. All right, thank you so much, everyone. And a special thanks again to Barbara and Lisa. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and please reach out for feedback. All right. Take care, guys.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.